Welcome to Neural Nexus Podcast, where we explore the hottest topics shaping the world. Let's dive in.
All right, so welcome back, everyone. We're jumping right into a story that's been all over the news lately, this whole Tesla Cybertruck explosion in Vegas, and then there's that attack in New Orleans. What's really got people talking is that both of these incidents, well, they involved rented vehicles, so there's this possible connection that everyone's trying to figure out. We're going to be taking a look at some reports from the BBC and the Washington Post and see if we can make any sense of it all.
It's definitely a situation with a lot of unanswered questions, right? And the rented vehicles, that just throws a whole other wrench into the mix, for sure.
Totally. And let's start with the Vegas explosion. We've got footage of this Cybertruck, brand new, parked out front of the Trump Hotel, and then suddenly, bam, it's engulfed in flames. But what's crazy is this wasn't your average car fire, was it?
No, not at all. The visuals are wild. It's almost like watching fireworks go haywire with these bursts of color shooting out from the truck bed. And in the aftermath, you see the charred remains of the truck, and there are gas canisters just scattered around, which, yeah, that definitely raises some eyebrows.
For sure. And it wasn't just luggage in that truck. Reports say it was loaded with fuel canisters, plus those firework mortars you mentioned. 7 people ended up with minor injuries, but tragically, the driver didn't make it. So, given what they found in the truck, what are your first thoughts on a possible motive here?
Well, it's hard to see this as anything but intentional, right? With all those materials, it seems planned. And then you add in the fact that this happened so soon after the New Orleans attack. It's definitely something to think about.
Absolutely. So let's talk about that New Orleans attack. What do we know about what happened there?
This one was, well, it was horrific. A man drove a truck straight into a crowd. The truck had an IS flag on it. 15 people died, and there were a lot more injured.
That IS flag, that definitely raises some concerns. Does this point to a connection with maybe a bigger terrorist organization?
It's definitely something investigators are going to be looking at. And then there's the fact that authorities found IEDs near the scene. Those are basically homemade bombs, right? So that adds this whole other level of planning that's incredibly disturbing.
So we've got 2 violent incidents happening close together, both involving rented vehicles. It's no wonder everyone's wondering if they're connected somehow.
Right, and authorities are actively investigating that possibility. What's particularly interesting is that both of these vehicles were rented through Turo, that app-based rental company.
And Turo's spokesperson has released a statement saying they're fully cooperating with the investigation and emphasizing that neither renter had anything in their background checks that would have flagged them as a security risk. But with these incidents happening through rented vehicles, does this raise any concerns about how these app-based companies handle security compared to traditional rental places?
You know, it's a valid point. With those traditional companies, you're usually meeting face-to-face, so there's more chance for scrutiny. The whole convenience and anonymity of app-based rentals, well, it could create vulnerabilities that maybe need to be addressed.
Yeah, definitely something to consider. And now, because of the potential for terrorism, the FBI is involved. What does that tell us about where this investigation might go?
Well, I think it shows they're taking the possibility of terrorism very seriously. They're going to be looking at everything, like whether the Vegas explosion should be classified as an act of terrorism, if there are international ties, that kind of thing. It's important to remember, though, that as of right now, there's no evidence directly linking either incident to IS.
Okay, so we have these 2 incidents, both really concerning, and we're left wondering if they're linked. But there's another layer to this whole connection to Elon Musk with the Cybertruck, and then the fact that it happened at the Trump Hotel.
Exactly. And those 2 guys, they're publicly connected too, right? Trump recently appointed Musk to one of those presidential advisory commissions, so that's definitely something investigators will want to look at.
So what are authorities saying about the possibility of this being connected to Musk or Trump in any way?
At this point, they're not ruling anything out. They're exploring all angles, looking at any potential connections to both men, but, and I can't emphasize this enough, there's no concrete evidence to say either of them is involved at this stage.
And we also had that eyewitness account from Stephen Furlando. He saw the explosion from his hotel room in Trump Tower, and he said the force of the blast actually shook the windows. That must have been terrifying.
Totally, yeah. That account really gives you a sense of just how powerful this explosion was.
So we've covered a lot here, laid out the details of both incidents, talked about the potential connections, and where do we go from here? So we've got all these facts laid out, but now let's get into the why of it all, right? What could be the motives behind these attacks, and how does all this connect to, bigger issues like terrorism and all the anxiety in society these days.
Yeah, that's the key question, isn't it? And it's the one investigators are really wrestling with right now. With the Vegas explosion, you've got those fuel canisters, the firework mortars, which definitely points to something deliberate. But the why, that's still a big question mark. Was this, some personal grudge, just random violence, or something more?
And with that New Orleans attack, I mean, that IS flag on the truck,
Yeah.
that immediately makes you think about terrorism, right?
Mhm.
And you mentioned the IEDs earlier, which shows a level of planning, some real sophistication. Could we be looking at like a lone wolf attack, someone inspired by IS ideology? Or could there be a connection to a larger network?
That's the $1 million question for sure. It's possible this was just one person, maybe radicalized online, someone who wanted to cause terror. But then you've got the planning, the IEDs, and maybe a connection to what happened in Vegas. So it does make you wonder if there's something more coordinated going on.
And if it does turn out to be linked to a larger terrorist organization, what kind of impact could that have on everything, on politics, on society?
Well, the implications are pretty huge. You could see way more security everywhere, more surveillance, maybe even stricter travel restrictions, and it could make the divisions that are already out there even worse, more fear, more mistrust.
And we've already seen how fast those conspiracy theories can spread online, especially when you have figures like Musk and Trump in the mix. How do you think these events might play into all those existing narratives and divisions?
It's like throwing fuel on a fire that's already burning, right? The connection to Musk and Trump, even if it's a thin connection, it's going to get people talking, get those conspiracy theories going. We have to remember there are still a lot of unknowns here, and jumping to conclusions without evidence, that can be dangerous.
But even without those answers, these events, they tap into some of our deepest fears, right? Especially in a world that's so interconnected, so driven by technology.
Oh, absolutely. These incidents, they show how even everyday things, technology that's all around us, can be turned into weapons. I mean, the Vegas explosion with the Cybertruck, that's a prime example of how innovation can be, twisted and used for something destructive.
And the New Orleans attack, it makes you think about how these extremist ideas spread online and how hard it is to fight terrorism in this digital age. We're constantly flooded with information, and it's tough to know what's real and what's not.
And that brings us to something really important, this whole idea of critical thinking and media literacy. We need to be smarter about the information we consume, especially online. We have to question sources, look at the evidence, and be careful about those sensational headlines and that emotional rhetoric.
It's so easy to get caught up in the fear, the outrage, especially when we're feeling vulnerable.
Hmm.
But like you said, critical thinking is key, and part of that is being aware of our own biases and how misinformation can play on our emotions.
Absolutely. We have to recognize how our own biases can shape how we see things and be willing to challenge our own assumptions. And it's also important to have those open conversations, even when it's about sensitive topics. We have to be able to disagree respectfully.
So even though these incidents have caused a lot of fear and uncertainty, we can choose how we react, right? We can give in to panic and division, or we can use this as a chance to strengthen our communities, to recommit to reason and understanding.
That's a great point. We can't ignore the real threats out there, but we can face them with courage, with compassion, and with a determination to build a more informed and resilient society.
And I think it's important to acknowledge the emotional toll these events have on people, on communities. It's not just about statistics or politics, it's about real lives that have been changed forever by these acts of violence.
Yeah, that's true. We need to recognize the trauma, the grief, the impact of these events.
Yeah.
We need to support the people who have been directly affected, offer empathy and understanding to those struggling with fear and anxiety, and we have to work together to create a sense of safety and security in our communities.
So we've talked about motives, about the wider impact on society, the importance of critical thinking, and the emotional side of it all. As this investigation moves forward, what are some key takeaways you think are important for our listeners? So we've talked about some possible motives and, the broader impacts of these attacks, but as we look ahead, it's important to think about the long-term consequences. How could these events like shape the world in the years to come?
That's a really good question. I think these incidents force us to confront some really fundamental questions about security, about technology, about the nature of threats. in the modern world, you know?
Okay, yeah, let's start with security. You mentioned earlier that we might see more security measures because of these events. What could that actually look like?
Well, you could see a lot more surveillance, out in public spaces, tighter security at airports, train stations, big events, and maybe even more scrutiny of what people are doing online.
And how could all those increased security measures, how could that impact individual freedoms and privacy?
Yeah, that's something we have to think about very carefully. It's a balancing act, isn't it? We want to keep people safe, but we also want to protect freedom. There's always that risk that, in trying to be more secure, we end up losing the very liberties we're trying to protect.
Yeah, it raises the question of, like, what are we willing to give up to feel safer? Are we okay with, more surveillance if it means maybe preventing future attacks? These are some tough ethical questions we're going to have to face as a society.
Exactly. And these conversations, they need to be nuanced. They need to be thoughtful. We need everyone at the table, and we need to weigh the potential benefits against the potential downsides very carefully.
And technology is such a big part of this too. Like the Cybertruck explosion, that shows how, something innovative can be used for something destructive.
Right.
So how do we encourage new technology while also making sure it's not misused?
It's complicated. We can't just shut down progress because we're afraid, right? But we also can't ignore the dangers. It takes collaboration between governments, tech companies, researchers to come up with ethical guidelines, safety protocols, ways to prevent misuse.
And it also means, like, individuals have to be more tech savvy, more aware of the risks. We have to, learn about online security, be careful about what we share, understand that technology can be used for good or bad.
For sure. Being digitally literate, that's more important now than ever. We need to give people the knowledge and skills to navigate the digital world safely and responsibly.
And let's not forget about the human element here. These attacks, they weren't just about technology or ideology. These were acts of violence by people. So how do we address the things that lead to radicalization, to violence?
It's a really important question, but it's not an easy one to answer. It means addressing inequality, promoting social cohesion, creating environments where people feel like they belong, like they have a purpose. And it also means addressing mental health and supporting people who might be vulnerable to extremism.
So it's not just about, law enforcement and security. It's about creating a society that's more just, more equitable, more compassionate, where everyone feels valued, connected.
Exactly. It's about getting to the root causes of violence. It's about creating a world where everyone feels safe and secure.
So if you're listening to this, what should you take away from all of this? First, remember, staying informed is crucial. Find those credible news sources. Be critical of the information you're seeing and talk about these issues with others. Have those discussions.
And don't underestimate what you can do. Support organizations that are working for peace and understanding. Speak out against hate speech and prejudice whenever you see it. And fight for policies that put human rights and social justice first.
These events, they might have shaken us, but they've also reminded us that we're all in this together, and we have a responsibility to create a better future together. A future where technology is used for good, where we celebrate our differences, and where peace wins out.
That's a future worth fighting for. Let's move forward with hope, with courage, with a commitment to creating a world where violence like this isn't tolerated, ever.
That's all for our deep dive today. We hope this conversation has given you some things to think about, some insights to take away. Remember, the search for understanding, it never ends. So stay curious, stay engaged, stay hopeful. Until next time.